My name is Megan Jacobs. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. I'm an associate professor here in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. And this is part of a series of monthly public lectures as part of the UNM Honors College Discovery Series, in which we highlight a range of scholars and their unique research and methodologies. Today, we'll be hearing from the lauded poet Orlando White. While some of us are physically at UNM, others are sprinkled over the state or beyond. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the original peoples of the land in which the University of New Mexico sits. The Sendio Pueblo and the Navajo Nation have ties and stories on this land. We gratefully recognize this history. One little bit of housekeeping. I know most of you have your cameras turned off, but I just want to let you know that this presentation is going to be recorded with the intention of placing it on our Honors College website for others to view after today's presentation. So if you'd prefer for your likeness not to be recorded, feel free to turn your camera off. It is my honor to introduce our presenter, Orlando White. Orlando is the author of 2 books of poetry. Bone Light, his first book, was published in 2009 and is described by Kazim Ali as a, quote, careful excavation on language and letters and the physical body. His most recent book, Letters, published in 2015, received the Poetry Center Book Award. Of White's most recent book, Eleni Secliano states, quote, language is playful and dangerous. And these poems know equally its pleasures and threats. What White does beautifully is scrape at the bone of the word to unclothe it, uncolor it, make it naked, and stand before us, vulnerable and new, end quote. White's work has appeared in such publications as Ploughshares, the Kenyon Review, and Salt Hill. Orlando is the recipient of a residency from the prestigious Lannan Foundation, and he is a professor at Diné College in Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Orlando White. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you everyone who's attending tonight. Thank you for tuning in. So I'll go ahead and get started here. I'm gonna kind of move back and forth in between my, my 2 books and some short little essays and some new work. So this first one is titled To See Letters. Before I get started, if my internet out here on the reservation is a little goes in and out, so maybe Megan, you can just send me a chat message if I'm cutting out, okay? To see letters. Everything I write requires this alphabet. It was a notion I did not know when I was 6 years old. In kindergarten, I was more interested in the image of a letter on a flashcard. I noticed its shape distinguishing itself from its background. Then, with my eyes, I tore the O in half. In that moment, I felt language separate from its form. I recall my mother playing a word puzzle. She'd circle a line of letters amongst the many other letters scattered on the page. She treated each word carefully, never touching the pen to the letters. Then she would give me the pen. I would circle random letters. She'd smile and give me a hug. My mother once told me that my stepdad found a picture of my real father. He ripped it up. To this day, I still do not know who my father is. I always called my stepdad David, and he called me by my middle name, Orson. To him, it was better than looking at me and calling me son. I am still ashamed of my middle name. He tried to teach me how to spell. I showed him homework from my first grade class. It was a list of words assigned for me to spell. He looked at me as he was sharpening a pencil with his knife. I remember the way he forced my hand to write, how the pencil stabbed each letter, the lead smearing. I imagine each word bruising as I stared at them. The words reminded me of the word puzzle. But without images, it meant nothing at all. He said, spell them out. I could not. Then spell them out, then sound them out first. I recall a day like many other days in grammar school when an older boy made fun of me because I could not speak proper English. I always mispronounced words and I would wonder how to spell them. I could not move the pencil in my hand. I saw the letters lined up on paper, but I wanted to circle them. He shouted out, spell them out, you little fucker. I'm going to hit you if you don't. I remember the shape of his fist. No one was around, not even my mother. It was as close to intimacy as I got with my stepdad. I did not say anything to anyone. He bought me toys as an act of contrition. I forgave him. When David hit me in the head, I saw stars in the shape of the alphabet. Years later, my fascination for letters resulted in poems. Paper milk. Newborn alphabet cries its vowels on the page, nourishes them. A opens into a U. It becomes a tiny cup, fills with paper milk. The E, too, unfolds, unfurls to an O, and nurses on the colostrum of pulp. Thought attaches sound from motherese to thin sheet of white. Form, a structure of feeling. An instrument of print means to foster. The verso and recto will be caretakers of our infant text. As writing develops, calcium to bring life to ink, letters become collagen of thoughts. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay. A is ox head. Dark snout and horn, body blank as milk. Originates from measurement of animal to print, first as labor on landscape. Then on page as libel. People create from what their objects. Contribute for them. That's why text behaves. Ox, a living thing, non-human, image of subsistence. It is also on paper A. Metaphor. Sometimes ox will be a loop with an adjacent vertical stroke, or a circle with an arc over it. Indefinite. E. On knee to bow, a human figure. Prayer at the white altar page. For letters commit our sins. But in turn, redeem us from print. He wears what appears to be a black shirt and white clerical collar. Is that why we trust him with our thoughts? To serve as subpoena to the book? And yet, always to disavow a system common to sentence? This is why we sound out. To spell. Invoke pause where he's speechless at the end of a word. To worship in silence. The eye is a cricket. The book is open. Can you hear and see the cricket? Listen. It sounds as if someone is rubbing the bristles of two combs together. Look closer. Legs are struggling. like an upside down fly, like a blinking eyelash. Touch it, and you will feel its tiny hairs. There is a letter on the page that has bent legs. Before you close the book, let it leap off the paper. Oh, with dark iris, white pupil, spatial, focal point on surface, guides, into white, letter hypnotizes to stay. Alive after meaning fades. Bold light projects outwards. Depth pressure. Squint periphery. Singes pretext from nerve sight. To hue of page margin. Paper cornea. Insulates thoughts from pale, liquid burn of aperture letter. A calcine color to ash bleach. So I'm going to move on to a short little essay that I wrote titled Play and Imagination on the one-word poem. The process of writing a one-word poem on the page involves playfulness, along with the willingness to take risks with imagination, much like a toddler who scribbles letters for the first time on paper. Using the crayon to draw what a word might look like and creating language outside the boundaries of standard writing. In a way, to think like a child who is creating his first word on paper is to engage in a true act of writing. Because to write means to link the brain, the eyes, the hands simultaneously. It's that coordination of the poet's artistic vision and creative action, which can reveal a word's identity through its image. In that moment, the poet writes mum in cursive and watches its shape flow like a wave across the page, or gig, to notice how the lower loop of G shapes itself into an earlobe. Through this practice, the poet guides his hand through a graphological meditation, which then becomes an artistic mediation between self and page. This is when he reimagines language, reimagines the relationship of writing and experience to move toward a literary moment. Much like the moment when discovering a new word like Nifel Abada, that feeling of surprise and curiosity one has towards its spelling and meaning. Let's look at a one-word poem that is meant to be seen rather than read, a poem that's meant to be viewed as image rather than text. In the poem I by Aram Sarayan, he adds an additional Y and E to the word to enact a sense of play and inventiveness. And in a way, by adding extra letters, the word visually becomes what it means. At first glance, this one-word poem appears disorienting. It takes a second for our eyes to adjust to it. Perhaps it's because as viewers, the extra Y and E skew our perception a little. So we find ourselves scanning the word back and forth as if in a REM state. But what makes this poem effective too is its play on a palindrome. A palindrome is a word or sentence that reads the same forward and backward. Some examples are toot, minim, never odd or even, or draw, O coward. In his one-word poem, Sarayan gets us to understand his interaction with language. His use of a palindrome gets us, as readers, to look closely at language, to literally eye the word. But then he adds those extra letters and suddenly the poem becomes visible as an image. In Ian Daly's essay, quote, "You call that poetry?" unquote, Sarayan says, "I got intrigued by the look of individual words. The word guarantee, for instance, looks to me a bit like a South American insect. The one-word poem gets us to think about the word as picture and reminds us as poets that to develop the mind's eye, we must open ourselves up to seeing language and to feel the energy of a letter. The origin of the A, for example, derives from a pictogram dating back to the 11th century in the Middle East. The A is an ox head, and if you rotate it until its stems point upward, you will see the ox's muzzle in the area between the apex and crossbar. Once we are aware that the letter is a picture, it's up to us as writers to imagine the ox plowing the field of the page, getting it ready for us to plant and expand our imagination. So I'm going to share a few one-word poems with you all. And I'll just jump right into them. Ish, 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 hush, ish, ish. Sod, Gla, 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 gla. Wa, to, bloodis. Chowen, te. These next ones are just visual, if you will. So I'll, just I try to I try to make them as big as possible for the PowerPoint, but you actually might have to kind of just look closer to your screen, But anyway, they're more visual, if you will. Analogy. I. On the page, a man the size of a letter wears a white necktie and a dark suit. J. Next to him, a woman the size of a letter, 2. She wears a white scarf and a black gown. Hyphen. Not a punctuation mark, not a punctuation sign, but a mark of accentuation written between two lovers. I, J. He says, I am a single bone under the skin of a letter. She says, I too am a letter but I have a curved hip bone. I-J. See them on the white bed of a page, how they hyphenate, how they will create language together. Lowercase I and J. Man with one leg, no arms, wears black suit, white necktie. Woman in black dress, white scarf, no arms too. On white sheet, both attend paper funeral. Tears, ink. But you can put a hyphen between them. Look, they are holding hands. So I'm going to end with another short essay, short essay, titled Functional White, Crafting Space and Silence. The white space is just as important as the text in a poem, whether it's the counter that shapes an O or S, a line break after a word, or a caesura within a line. With space, one can shape around, one can shape sound and language to create a poetic field. And with that, one may express a silence. When we write or type, our focus seems to be on a small percentage of the paper, which is where the text is placed. But around it, there lies a pause, which is where the text is placed. But around it, there lies a pause, a momentary rest that hibernates, much like a semi-brief rest within a measure, or like a crease pattern after unfolding a sheet of paper. Space holds rhythm and structure. Plus, what are letters, words, punctuations, and sentences without the music and form of the page? A particular text that comes to mind is Lecture on Nothing by John Cage, in which he composes measures of white space. In his introduction to the lecture, he emphasizes how to read the text by saying, "This should not be done in an artificial manner, which might result from an attempt to be too strictly faithful to the position of words on the page, but with the rubato which one uses in everyday speech." In a way, Cage reminds us not to depend on language, but rather to consider the cadence of line in relation to the page's expanse, where the paper and body and ink and breath exist simultaneously in order to create a literary moment for the writer. That connection between poet and page becomes proportional to each other, where symmetry occurs. In that instant, you ascend, then descend, and finally crossbar the capital A. Your hand is the letter, along with your body synchronizing with ink and vice versa, because there is a pulse in the human figure. There is pulse within the folio as well. The poetic existence and space between the written language is the vital sign of silence. Designers of publications refer to the white spaces of the page as functional white. Functional white guides the reader through a text. White space allows text to exist in a specific position on the page in relation to the background. And perhaps that background is the throat of paper, inhaling language and exhaling sound and silence. Like Inuit throat singers, when the page and poet are face to face, close enough for both their lips to meet, their breaths subsist off each other. And in an instant, that natural ornate experience blends person and page. The line and its breath, with its origin from the lung of the page, is sejouric, as we are too. Because pauses construct the spaces which interweave letters, words, and thoughts on a sheet of paper. Though silence on the page develops habitually from our use of techniques as poetry writers, sometimes being aware of the white spaces, rather than concerning ourselves with punctuation and language, allows us to experience the silence personally. Perhaps text sometimes acts as a polarizing filter that darkens the paper and dims the brightness of the page. So it's up to us to write and unwrite and interpret and reinterpret the page through space by making language and silence collaborate. Because there is another rhythm waiting to reawaken from the depths of the page, and we should construe and create the pause before and during the reading and writing of a poem. Thank you. So that this is, if you can see it, it's an excerpt from Lecture on Nothing by John Cage. So I will see here, stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Are you willing to entertain some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Awesome. If you guys would like to place your questions either in the chat or just turn on your mics and you can verbally ask them, I think that would be wonderful.
All right. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed that. That was awesome to listen to, and I really like your work. My question is, it's not really about it's so when you turn your camera off, you have a quote that pops up, and I was curious where that's from. It's the "You are the Scientist" quote. When you turn off your camera, it pops up. I was curious.
Oh yeah, that is by an artist from South America, and I'm forgetting his name right now. Once I think about it, I promise I'll put it in the chat. But he works with text and things like that, and I'm just spacing out his name right now. But yeah, it's kind of a really cool you know, I use it for my my profile pic for my social media sometimes. So
I see in the chat there's a question from Amy. And she states, are you equally as fascinated with letters from other alphabets around the world?
yeah, I mean, I think because I'm working with English. I feel like it's still very much a baby language. So I think for me, that's why I sort of find myself engaging it, I think, much more. I mean, I looked at other languages in terms of them being images, so I think of Arabic writing. I can even think of the Cherokee syllabary, right? I believe that Sequoia, who was a Cherokee, I believe he had created this newspaper called, I think it was called the Phoenix. I might be wrong, but it was all written in the Cherokee language. And what's really interesting about Sequoia was that, he was able to look at English, for example, and somehow in this really weird, strange way interpret through looking at it, right? Looking at its image, but also paying attention to its sound, but primarily its image. So if you look at the Cherokee syllabary, you can kind of see that transition a little bit, right, from the Roman alphabet. But the thing about Sequoia, I believe, is he never spoke a word of English, right, and didn't read English, and so he was able to create this unique syllabary for his own people, the Cherokee people. It's really beautiful syllabary if you ever get a chance to just look at it. And so yeah, I mean, I'm really fascinated with even my own language as a Diné. I shared some of those earlier in the reading where I had these visual one-word poems that were in my language. Unfortunately, we don't have a syllabary, as Diné. But the sounds are interesting, and like the first one-word visual poem that I read, hashtlish or tlish, that's our word for mud. So we say hashtlish. So the sound of it, right, is the sound of when someone steps in mud. So it makes that tlish sound. So it's onomatopoeic, right? It's onomatopoeia. So we have a lot of that in Diné language. So that's kind of what I was playing off of, in those particular one-word poems. But yeah, other languages are really interesting. I mean, I think in a certain kind of way, English is a very foreign language here. It's I like to see the alphabet as, I mean, they started off as images, as pictograms, and then obviously developed into what we use now. But for me, I do think of it as a foreign language for me, at least in my head. When I'm creating, like a one-word poem piece, or writing and thinking in English. Like I said, it just feels like something I just barely discovered, even though it's been around me my whole life. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I have a question just kind of to contextualize your work. I'm just curious. You know, your work seems to really put the reader slash viewer in a kind of meditative state, like it helps us slow down. And I'm, you know, it seems to kind of strip one reality to unfold a new reality through, in part, maybe redaction, elimination, the use of white space. And I'm just wondering if this approach, like if it has anything, if your desire, if I'm synthesizing your desire correctly, but if that desire has anything to do with just sort of like the busyness of modern lives. And I'm just wondering, yeah, I guess I'm wondering a little bit about that process and that pace
yeah.
and that sense of time that you develop, like when reading it and just when looking at it as well.
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate in creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts, I had some wonderful professors there like Arthur Z and John Davis, Evelina Lucero. I remember taking a class, it was a contemporary poetry class, and we were studying the different schools in poetry, you know, starting with the academics and then, you know, the beat generation, deep image, right, language. So the school I became really fascinated with was the Black Mountain poets. And so Charles Olson, in collaboration with Robert Creeley, created this really wonderful manifesto titled Composition by Field, or I can't believe I'm forgetting, I'm like spacing it out right now. It's called, give me a moment here. I can't believe I mean, it's like, it's called Projective Verse. So this manifesto is called Projective Verse. And what's interesting about Projective Verse is that they say things like, you know, whereas poetry before, or at least in the academic sense, was that the idea that poetry, the origin of the line in poetry is meter. So then Black Mountain movement came along, and Projective Verse, you know, presented this idea that the origin of the line in poetry is breath. So so that's one thing that really influenced me a lot. And I read this poem by Charles Olson. It was called Maximus to Gloucester. I think it's letter withheld 27. And so if you look at that poem visually, it starts with sort of prose, and then in a moment uses a stanza, which is a couplet. But then as the words and the language and the phrases begin to move down the page, it begins to break apart. And so for me, that was really fascinating in terms of like what the page was doing and how Olson was thinking about the page. And one of the things about Projective Verse, it's about this idea of energy and how energy translates from the poet to the page, and then from the page to the reader. So that I was really fascinated by that. And, you know, I did a little, Kazim Ali did an introduction for my first book, Bone Light, at PSA, Poetry Society of America. And I wrote like a little tiny, like short, you know, I guess introduction to my work in my first book. And I talk about that particular poem and how it, you know, it taught me to think about silence on the page. It taught me how to think about page as, you know, movement, right? Even if words are not there, you know, there's always a constant energy that is, you know, um, vibrating. And so the silence is really, I've been reading like that for ever since I was an undergrad, before my first book came out. And so, it was just my influence from projective verse, really, and the Black Mountain movement. Also my own language as a Diné. We have these things called glottal stops. So they look like apostrophes, but those apostrophes in our language is a sound. So it's sort of an abrupt pause, but it is a pause. It serves as a pause nonetheless. So the apostrophe for us is a sound. It's a letter in our language. So those are some of the things that really influenced me. And plus, I really like the idea of how to, to really think about and be aware of, of words on the page, to be aware of phrases, letters, diacritical marks, punctuation, right? These can all serve as a way, in which, the poet can essentially choreograph, right? Like so many ideas and so many feelings and so many types of, music. So, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, I totally do. Thank you. It's really enlightening.
Are there any other questions?
Kind of just going off that, I was gonna ask, do you ever find yourself inspired by hearing the way that like other people speak, even in person? Like, do you ever feel like you can kind of apply that to your own poetry?
Yeah, I like hearing poets read. One of the things I always, I guess maybe in terms of my process, even when I read like a poem, I'm always paying attention to the sound first. I trust that meaning will eventually come later. So, I think of someone like Lucy Tapahanso, who's a Diné poet, and I don't know. I believe she's still there at UNM, but she if she's there, you should definitely take a class with Lucy Tapahanso. She's a Diné and a poet, a storyteller, and sometimes I'll like when I listen to Lucy speak, even just in general, she just has this like really calm energy that makes you feel, maybe comforted by a grandparent, right? By a loving grandparent, or like it's just that like that blanket that just wraps around you, and it's so warm and calming, and you feel safe, and you feel like you exist. And so sometimes I would listen to Lucy Tapahansa, and I would make this joke, like, like if Lucy even just read, the dictionary out loud, like just the sound of her voice would, it's for me, it's it's a good feeling. It's an energy in which, allows me and gives me an opportunity to breathe, and think about my thoughts a little bit more clearly. But her work also does that for me as well. So, and there are other people, but that's just one example. So, but yeah, yeah. I hope that answers your question. Sarah, is it?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone else have a question that you'd like to pose to Orlando? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that lovely reading. It was really beautiful, powerful.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Megan, and for all of you tuning in tonight. Or, thank you so much for listening and being present.